Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Live from the upper room. I apologize for my disheveled self and for being a few minutes late. My parents just got back from a 2-week vacation, so I was helping them get settled. And we just got back in from walking the dog, so obviously my hair is all messed up from the humidity. But I'm very excited for the portion for today because we're talking about the different administrations of God and how he interacts and deals with humanity. Dear brother Ace, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming. You may like this one, Ace. Let's see. Boop. This one will be part 11 of part 1, Conscious. So let's get started. Conscious and consciousness are as closely connected in sense as they are in form. Indeed, the verb of sunadesis, together perceiving or conscious, is sunidio, which means to be conscious. The Authorized Version renders it to be privy, as in Acts 5:2, consider in Acts 12:12, beware in Acts 14:6, and know in 1 Corinthians 4:4. To this last passage, Wilgrim's Concordance adds, lit, am conscious. In every passage, be conscious is a better rendering, so that in essence, conscious is a form of consciousness. It is indeed a question whether Hebrews 10:2 should be rendered, having been once cleansed, have no longer a conscience as to sins, or a consciousness of sins, for the original is of sins, and the sense comes to the same thing. It would seem from this that consciousness or conscience, like consciousness, is a relative perceptive faculty. One might reason that the experience of sin would greatly strengthen the conscious, so that when once cleansed from sin, the conscience would be present more than ever. But this seems to be denied in this passage. It disappears when sin is cleansed away. Just as we have no conscience of our bodily functions when all is well, but are disagreeably conscious when something goes wrong. As conscience seems to be used only in relation to sin in the scriptures, it seems to depend on sin for its presence, and we'll see why later on. One who does not yield to sin has a good conscience. One who does have a evil conscience. It is consciousness as to right or wrong, good or evil. When we are beyond the reach of evil, we will have nothing to which a conscience can respond. Hence, it ceases to function, and its practicality extinct. Before our first parents ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they lacked this knowledge, hence they had no conscious or consciousness of either. This consciousness did not come to them until after they sinned. And again, we'll find out why in a few paragraphs. Then it found immediate expression. What told them that they were naked? Conscious. Before they possessed the knowledge of good and evil, they were no more disturbed by their acts than an infant. We are not born with a conscience. Babies are sometimes unutterably cruel to animals without at all realizing it or even meaning it. They have not yet developed a conscience, for they cannot distinguish good from evil. Conscious, as its main stem in the Greek indicates, is a perception. In usage, it has become restricted to the perception of good and evil. Before sin entered, there could be no such thing, and when sin appears or disappears, it will go along with it. It is only a temporary function which is dependent on sin for its existence. We cannot reason that man was created with a conscience, hence always has had one and always will have one. I would not be surprised if Adam were created conscious, but it would be fully to deduce from this that he or his descendants cannot become unconscious. Mankind is not conscious perhaps a third of their lifetime while they are asleep. Consciousness is not a vital element of humanity, but a state. and experience, apart from which he may live and move and be. So with conscious, which is consciousness in relation to right and wrong, where no evil exists, there can be no corresponding consciousness or conscience. When sins are cleansed away, we are no longer conscious of them. Hence, we have no conscience. So, what the writer of this article is basically saying is that the consciousness is ultimately tied with the knowledge of good and evil, because it's the main thing that helps us discern what is right and wrong. And we technically didn't get this still small voice, if you want to call it, until after we ate the fruit, which ironically gave us the consciousness to actually know what right and wrong is. So you could say that the forbidden fruit gave us realization. One of the remarkable features of the entrance of sin is the entire absence of any indication of a conscience in either Eve or Adam. When we read the record, we wonder why Eve's conscience does not intervene. She should have hesitated, at least, before going contrary to God's precept. There is not the least hint that she had any such misgivings as we would have under similar circumstances today. But right afterwards, what a change. Consciousness of having done wrong immediately drove them from the divine presence. They had a bad conscience then, though it worked very well. Becoming conscious of sin and guilt is conscience. How could they have this before when all was very good? Consciousness of evil cannot exist from the presence of evil. Even now, one who always seeks to please God is hardly conscious of a conscience. And when sin itself is repudiated, conscience will go with it. In Israel, very little is revealed in reference to the conscience. Even our Lord made no reference to it. Why is this? Where God's law is, there is no need to depend on a conscience or that still small voice, because you don't have to go based off of what the still small voice says. You have God's law right there. The conscience may be weak, as stated in 1 Corinthians 8:7, or bad, as stated in Hebrews 10:22, or defiled in Titus 1:15, or even cauterized in one of my favorite verses, 1 Timothy 4:2. It is by no means an ideal deterrent from evil or guide to good, even though it may at times affect the what the law fails to do, as stated in Romans 2:15. It is by no means a reliable deterrent, essentially. But God's law is always good, meaning the law can't steer you wrong, where a conscience can. It can be depended upon. It does not vary with the individual or with the times. Therefore, in the Hebrew revelation, the law takes the place of the conscience, and the appeal is made to the heart. It is because Paul deals with the nations who have no law that he appeals so often to his own conscience and to that of his readers, meaning those of the nations wouldn't know what the law is, so he goes more along the lines of what they would base everything off of. It's like the atheist humanists that you see today. They judge whether or not everything is right and wrong based on how they feel about it, based on their own consciousness, which could be right in some areas, but completely wrong in others due to it being either weak, cauterized, defiled, bad. It's the old subjective morality argument in play. We speak of an administration, not dispensation, of conscience because this was the leading innovation which characterized the era from the sin of Adam until the deluge or the flood of Noah. Before this, God had been personally present with the primal pair in the Garden of Eden, so God is directly with them. Thereafter, his close fellowship was broken. God withdrew. He gave no law to guide them. They and their offspring were left to themselves and their own consciousnesses. All that they had was the knowledge of good and evil and the consciousness that wrongdoing was displeasing to God, that is, conscience. This was the slender link that united them to God. It was the basic principle of his dealings with them. The object of the entire arrangement was to display the inability of mankind to get on without God, even though they knew good and evil and had conscience as a constant monitor to urge them to do good. Now, this is what I love about this particular portion because it talks about the administrations of God, and it shows how God is putting us through each and every possible opportunity to show the inability of man to do good apart from God. So we started off in the garden where God was directly with man in the state of innocence. Essentially, they had no conscience yet. They were completely without the knowledge of good and evil and made a bad decision. They still sinned. So, strike one, innocence, being completely innocent is not good enough, as we showed with the baby example. Doesn't matter that the baby didn't intend to hurt the animal, but even in innocence, even in not knowing evil and by extension good, it still doesn't make one holy or sinless. So that's out the way. Now we are in the state of conscience where they do have the knowledge of good and evil as a way to deter them from doing the bad and urge them to do the good. Let's see how this works out. It is necessary for God's glory and the good of all creation that man's infirmity and depravity should be displayed by a series of demonstrations, in each succeeding one of which he is found under more favorable conditions. So it actually gets easier and easier as the displays go on, and yet we still fail miserably. In order to do this, God alters his relations to mankind for a select part of it, so as to create a new and more likely situation. These are called administrations. In each, there is a special dispensation or dispensations, that is, divine gifts. But these should not be confounded with the administrations themselves, for the dispensations usually continue while the administrations change, meaning each divine gift that's given during administration is not particularly cemented to that administration. It's not like Aeonian life where once the eon is done or the administration is done, then the dispensation is done. No, it goes through the administration onto the next one. Administrations change. Besides, if we think of administrations as dispensations, we will always try to characterize them by his gifts rather than by that which characterizes God's relation to man and governs the modes of his dealings with the race. In my yieldingness, I allowed myself to be drawn into the confusion to some extent when I changed the name of the first administration from innocence to creation. May I be forgiven for such a conciliatory error. I think we could all forgive him for that. A special feature of these testings of mankind is the culmination of gifts in order to make the next trial less severe. Thus, after the knowledge of good and evil was imparted, it was not withdrawn when it failed. It has continued on ever since. Nor was government repealed when promise and law came on the scene. As a result, each dispensation remains and is added to the next gift in order to aid in lightening the next trial. But this rule does not always hold. Rather, it is reversed when the present grace gives place to indignation. So as of right now in the administration of grace, we have every single dispensation that God has given from the time of Adam to now. And they will be taken away once the tribulation happens. In order to show that man is a series of situations is needed, in order to show what man is, a series of situations is needed in which he fails under continual tests, each less exacting than the last. So it doesn't get harder, these tests. These tests get easier, and we still fail them spectacularly. Dispensations, God's gifts, are all intended to make the condition more favorable and give man a better chance of success. And what's that success? Of being able to become holy apart from God. The resultant condition is what characterizes the administration. Thus, as the result of the gift of authority, we have the administration of government. Once we see the divine purpose in these succeeding changes, all of the series become intelligible, and we have the desire to crystallize our findings by giving each a name. We could call the first no knowledge of good and evil, and thus keep within the divine vocabulary, as our word innocence is only a shorter way of saying this. We have no conscience about it. So with the next administration, which is after the eating of the fruit, all the way to the time of Noah. We might call it a with a knowledge of good and evil, but conscious expresses the same thing and saves these 6 words in 6 hyphens. It may not appear so at first glance, but the testing in Eden was the severest trial that will ever come to mankind because our innocent ancestors had no knowledge of good and evil. I strongly object to the use of the non-scriptural terms, so I discarded innocent. But we need an expression which condenses this fact in a single term. So I'm strongly inclined to restore innocence and will hold on to conscious, for it is its complement, describing as it does those who know good and evil. Without the knowledge of good and evil, mankind is as weak as water, and the bond between it and God can be snapped almost without effort or delay. So basically, the fact that they had no knowledge of good or evil at the time guaranteed their sinning. Their innocence actually guaranteed their sinning. And it was the hardest trial that humanity has ever undergone. And it was the absolute weakest form of man looking after himself, so to speak, or man producing his own righteousness. I guess you could verb it. So it happened at the very first trial. As we will see, this test finds men less prepared than any subsequent one. And the reason for this is the absence of conscience to warn Eve before she offended the Creator. So it didn't matter that God told them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They didn't have a conscience at the time. They didn't have a knowledge or that still small voice in them that said, listen to God. It's the right thing to do. Ignore the serpent. It's the wrong thing to do. They didn't have that. So they were as set up to fail as failure could be. Never since has man been so helpless except in the years of his infancy. And I find that to be very wise that we all start off that way too. It's almost like we have our own mini experience of this in our own life, where we start off in our infant state where we don't know anything. We're still doing wrong. We go into the conscious state and we end up doing wrong in probably our adolescent years. Once you hit teenage years, I find that's more of the government period. So we actually have a little microcosm of the macrocosm of what God teaches us. I thought that was very interesting. With the knowledge of good and evil, man was provided with a conscience, and so had a constant deterrent within himself, a still small voice, if you will. It took the place of God's personal presence and did not leave him helpless when he was away. But this inward restraint, this divine voice, which indwelt each one, was not sufficient to keep the race from utter depravity. Look to the actions of Cain and his entire line for reference. Man, left to the restraint of a simple conscience, corrupted himself beyond remedy. This is a great lesson to learn. In Eden, there was no restraint but the presence and prohibition of God himself. In his absence, this failed to keep man from destroying himself. Then comes conscience, then government by his fellows, until we come to the government of Christ himself with the iron club. All restraint fails when man is left only to himself. Only the power and the presence of God can preserve man. Therefore, after the deluge, meaning after the flood of Noah, an additional factor was granted. So as of right now, mankind has conscience, the knowledge of good and evil, and now has the gift, the dispensation of government, man keeping his fellow man in line, which has done much to keep mankind from going headlong into destruction once again. So government and having the Karens of the world wag their finger at the sheeple is what's keeping all of us, essentially, if we go based off what this is saying, from devolving back into what the generation of Cain went through. And it does make sense, because if you just have conscience and you're just led by your conscience, then you fall into subjective morality. And we saw that happen with Lamech. Lamech was the first one who had a polygamous marriage with two wives, and he thought it perfectly fine in his own conscience to be able to kill someone if someone did him wrong. And that's how the corrupt and defiled and cauterized conscience can lead people, if just left to that, to becoming as bad as Noah's generation. So now we have a conscience at this point in time and the authority of other men keeping people on track. Authority has been given over to man so that wickedness would be punished by man himself, and so deter him from the unbridled violence of the preceding period. Surely mankind ought to stand now, no longer innocent, but possessing the knowledge of good and evil, and restrained by the sword of the magistrate. Mankind as a whole has managed to keep from exterminating itself. Yet even this safeguard, as all of God's gifts, has been abused, so that Christ must be called upon to take the reins of government. When the failure of the human government was practically proven, as conscience had been, although both continue to this day, God makes a radical change in his dealings with humanity. Instead of taking them as a whole, he now selects an individual, Abraham, and later a nation, Israel, to be a channel of blessing to the rest. In a sense, the administrations of consciousness and government continue, for the mass of mankind are not immediately affected by the latter administrations. Yet even the promise to Abraham and the segregation of Israel were intended to reach all nations. A select few were to be helped by the promises. God came nearer to them by giving them an expectation, which is a very potent power in enabling a weak mortal to live upright. But as we know, even with this promise, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of his sons still sinned. Perhaps the most definite and practical assistance, yet the most disappointing, was God's next change. Okay, so we're in the administration of the promise from Abraham all the way to where the Israelites are at Mount Sinai. People are still sinning, so the promise hasn't pushed man to better themselves. They're still failing. You can argue that they're definitely better than Noah's generation, but they're still falling horribly short of God's divine standard. Instead of leaving the nation of his choice under the administration of government at a distance from him, he drew near to his own nation and dwelt among them himself. So now God's coming closer to Israel. Instead of leaving them in the dim light of conscience, he gave them his righteous law and became their king. Okay, so now God is now putting himself closer to humanity, even if it's just a segregated portion, and gave them a law. Truly, now they can get their act together. This one would think should enable them to live righteously and holy. It should, shouldn't it? And thus end the demonstration of man's frailty when apart from God. I feel like this is where the tribe of doubt is still camped out. They think if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they'll be able to stop at the administration of the law and prove that man, by law, can reach the holiness that God wants. But as we know, that's not going to happen. There's many administrations after this proving that it was a failure. At heart, they did not obey his righteous law, but became hypocrites, so that God had to drive them out of their land and scatter them among the nations. Even with all of this wonderful privileges, man proved an utter failure. Now remember, we have the law, God closer, a consciousness of good and evil and of governance. Mankind is still failing miserably. The administration of the incarnation. But what is the law compared to the incarnation, which is basically Christ on earth? The law demanded, Christ gave. The law was holy, but Christ was gracious. Surely men would love him and follow him, who was the very word and image of the deity which they followed. The people to whom he came had not only conscience, but law to enlighten them. Yet, thus highly privileged with all of God's gifts, man is not merely a failure, but a pervert and a murderer, for they crucified the gracious one. My God. This is a perfect outline of how man is just failing miserably time after time after time, and not just time after time, but time after time with additional assistance. Now we have the dispensations of spirit. Now at this evident that man is at enmity with God and cannot come to him apart from his Holy Spirit. God's dealings take on a new aspect. From now on, they are all characterized by the importation of his spirit. At Pentecost, he poured out all of his spirit on those of the nation of Israel who believed. Here at last is a power which can cope with human infirmity and sin. And it's the only one that can. And notice how it's not of man, but of God, and specifically God's Spirit. Yet in the Pentecost administration, the nation rejected his spirit and spurned his messengers. So long as they are not all thoroughly regenerated by his spirit, they are not able to respond to his mercy. Here, we have the sacred nation at its best. So the demonstration gradually ends. Just as God had turned to them, so now he has shown their failure. He turns back to mankind as a whole, but with a new dispensation, spirit, and a new administration. In taking up the nations, once again, God cannot very well deal with them as if they had been under the administration of promise or law or the incarnation or of the Spirit, because all of this additional God-given gifts or dispensations was on Israel alone at that time. Now, at the end of Pentecost, when they rejected a second time Jesus from coming and establishing the kingdom, God's changing his administration again to the whole of humanity and the nations, not Israel. He's putting them on the back burner for this particular administration. Hence, he ignores all this and reverts to Abraham before his circumcision. All these accumulated privileges had failed, so there is no profit in trying them once again under less favorable conditions. But the dispensation of the Spirit, even in Israel, leaped over the narrow confines of the other gifts and was freely bestowed upon the proselytes of the nation. And now we have the readjustment period. The call of Saul of Tarsus was itself a new departure in the ways of God and the indication of a new administration. So now we have another one. Through him, God gradually changes his method of dealing with both the nations and with Israel. Instead of heralding the kingdom to the Jews among the nations as the 12 had done in the land, in order to demonstrate their apostasy, he reaches the devout among the nations in order to provoke them, the Jews, to jealousy, as Moses had foretold in Deuteronomy 32:21. In this administration, which is dealt with in Paul's earlier epistles, the nations are blessed with Israel and receive their spiritual things while they themselves are still apostate. Again, talking about Israel being apostate. God had not dealt with the nations so before, nor did he even foretell such blessing in the prophets. So this was completely new and one of the secrets kept from the disruption of the world. As it was only a perpetuatory arrangement leading up to the next administration, we have called the readjustment. When Paul wrote Ephesians, after the heralding of the kingdom as recorded in the book of Acts had closed, God once more, again, changed his way of dealing, continuing the trend of the era of the readjustment. Then the nations were blessed through Israel in their defection. Now the character and place of blessing is changed from physical, earthly, to spiritual and celestial. Hence, it cannot come through the nation, but is independent of them. So this is the administration of grace right now, which you don't have to get through Israel as people will in the coming eon. From being aliens in God's kingdom, they have now become fellow citizens. From being guests at Israel's board, the nations become fellow members of God's family. From being aliens in God's kingdom, they become fellow citizens. From being split into two bodies by fleshly rights, they become joint members in one body, being Christ. The judgment and the kingdom administrations. I suppose that everyone will concede that the judgment era, which will follow the present, is not an administration of grace, nor was it kept a secret. Quite the contrary. God has warned both Israel and the nations of the time of judgment to come, in which his indignation will be poured out. So that will be the tribulation. This belongs to and closes man's day and ends the present evil eon. Hence, it cannot be incorporated into the kingdom administration for which it is a preparation. So basically, all of the gifts, all of the dispensations that we got up to this point are going to be proven at that time, at the end of the day of man, to be completely useless. Everyone's going to acknowledge we cannot do this on our own. We need God to intervene and literally put his spirit in us to be able to do anything right. And that's when the day of man finally comes to an end. Man's day is basically however long God has intended, which is, I believe, 6,000 years, for man to see that without God, without literally love, without his spirit, we cannot do anything correct. And every single possible interval, every single advantage, every single possible test that can be done to show, hey, we don't need God for our well-being. We don't need God to tell us what's right and wrong. We don't need God to be good, is going to be glaringly, obviously incorrect. And the kingdom era is going to be where God physically comes in, puts his spirit into Israel to where they do everything perfectly. It's going to be like second nature to them. And they're going to lead the nations who recognize that everything that they thought was good before, everything that they thought about man's ability, they will consider to be refuse and follow them in the kingdom era. That the kingdom era as a distinct administration is so generally concealed that it hardly seems necessary to point out its distinctive lines. Although it repeats features of the incarnation, for Christ is present, and Pentecost, for the Spirit is poured out, and blessing throws through Israel to the nations. And that concludes this portion of the problem of evil and the judgments of God. Dear friend Halsey, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming and your support. Miss Deborah, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming and your support, as well as you, dear brother Alex, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming and your support. Brother Vet, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming. The portion today was one of my favorites. I was reading through it, and I kind of already knew that the general idea of it was true, but to read it in the way that the author put it, it's almost like everything just clicked into place, where the pieces were close enough to where I'm like, oh yeah, that's that fits together. But to have it actually fit together like that and have it be said in such a way where it, to me at least, it makes sense. I really enjoyed this one. I hope everyone else thoroughly enjoyed it as well. Got here a little late. Oh, don't worry about it. I started a little late. My parents were on a 2-week-long vacation, and they just got back today. So I was helping them try to get settled in. So I didn't have the ample time beforehand to set everything up. But everything seems to be going pretty good this go round. So yeah, I hope everyone has a blessed Shabbos. I will see you all tomorrow for the next installment of the Parashot reading. We're still in Exodus, and I think we're getting to the portion of the golden calf. So that'll be a real heavy one to cover. Thank you so much for these Bible studies. Hey, I love doing them, sincerely. I really do love doing them. And like I said before, this book is so good that it would be a shame for people in the body of Christ not to know what it says. Because I know some people don't have the time to read, or they have a very hard time concentrating. So I want to make sure this information gets out to those who learn through hearing as opposed to reading. Thank you, Taylor. I am late too. Okay, I'm going to have to start handing out tardies to you guys. How dare you come late to my shows? Just kidding. I'm very happy that you're here, Stefan. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for even coming to support it. Billy A. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for your support. See you next time. Hey, tune in tomorrow at 9:30. We'll be covering the next part of Exodus if you are interested. I will rewatch. Yes, that is me. Awesome. I also love doing the videos too, because you can always rewatch parts where you're not necessarily getting something 100%. So videos are really good study tools. I can't lie. Shabbat shalom, everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. I will see you all tomorrow at 9:30. Everyone. Oh, Miss Cat. Shabbat shalom. Thank you so much for your support, sister. Oh, thank you. And if everyone is able to, try to light some Shabbos candles tonight. We don't have to, but it's always expedient to do something to kick off the weekend with something bright. And the Shabbos candles always put me in a very tranquil, relaxed mood. So if you have 2 candles, light them tonight. Love, grace, and peace, everyone.